The other big political news, though, this week came today from the UK Supreme Court in London, where just hours before we recorded this episode, judges unanimously ruled that a woman is defined by biological sex under equalities law. Now, this marks the end of a long-running legal battle, about 3 years roughly, which could have major implications for how sex-based rights apply Scotland, England and Wales. Just to be brief on this, on the kind of background, the court sided with Campaign Group for Women Scotland. They brought a case against the Scottish Government, arguing that sex-based protections should only apply to people that are born female. Now, since that ruling, John Swinney said that his government, quote, accepts the ruling of the Supreme Court, and adding that, quote, protecting the rights of all will inform his government's response. Now, Dougie, coming to you first, because I know how closely the Express has followed this story. Was this ruling anything of a surprise to you?
No, I think a woman is a woman. It's a pretty simple statement to make. I'm very aware that we're kind of three guys sitting here discussing it, so you're maybe not best placed to be involved. But the vast majority of women that I've spoke to about this were very much siding with For Women Scotland. They feel, decades of advancement in women's rights was being, eroded, put under threat. These kind of single-sex spaces were under threat. And I think it's pretty basic. For me, it was pretty basic stuff. And what again, it kind of exposes is you've got to ask who's advising the Scottish Government. Because this isn't the first time they've went to the Supreme Court and been hammered. We were going through it before we came in here. We came up with 10 almost straight away, where they've went to a really high court and been completely humiliated at taxpayers' expense. Now they'll say, they've got to defend their policies, but who's drafting these policies?
I should add that this was an appeal to the Supreme Court, because the Scottish Government did win a previous round of this particular legal battle in Scotland. It was in 2022 when Judge Lady Haldane said the definition of sex was, quote, not limited to biological or birth sex. So this was a step up from that ruling in 2022. But I do take your point, Dougie, that on the Supreme Court in particular, the Scottish Government has fought and lost a number of high-profile cases, not just on gender issues, but on things like the India F2, whether Holyrood had the right to call that, on the impact of the Brexit vote and all the rest of it. Just coming at you, Dan. Now, Amnesty International, I'm picking them as a representative of people of people who are disappointed by this ruling. They said they were disappointed with it, potentially considering the consequences for trans people, and just tying into that, I felt that this was a particularly So Judge Lord Hodge, who's one of the Supreme Court justices, in his ruling today, he said this should not be seen as a triumph of one side over the other, and stressed that the law still gives protection against discrimination to transgender people. Dan, I guess my question for you is, the Scottish Government has been very vocal on gender issues, particularly under Nicola Sturgeon. Now we have John Swinney in charge. Do you think that the current First Minister, will he be content to let this slide now? Do you feel that maybe this is something he can move on from?
I think the Supreme Court ruling, which I don't know to what extent it was a surprise in sort of the circles that are really following this story, but I've read that it went a lot further than was necessarily expected. But what it does provide is very, very obvious clarity on the issue of how these laws interrelate. And so that does, and we've already seen John Swinney say he accepts the findings. You would expect nothing less, but it does now give him political cover to unwind and untangle some of these really controversial policies. And obviously John Swinney was integral to Nicola Sturgeon's government. He was at the heart of sort of the advance of this agenda. And I think he will also want to reassure trans people, I'm sure, because a lot of trans people will be feeling vulnerable after this ruling. But I think also worth noting that the Supreme Court ruling doesn't actually infringe on trans people's rights in any way that I could see. They're still protected under the Equality Act from discrimination and harassment. Obviously, not all activists are going to feel that way. But even the charity Scottish Trans was saying, there isn't a need to panic. This might feel like a backward step, but we still need to see what that means. But just to get back to your question, I think for John Swinney, he's clearly trying to present himself ahead of the election as a sort of safe pair of hands, interested in common sense issues and bread and butter issues, and whether or not he would have actually taken this route otherwise, certainly it gives him the political cover to sort of untangle this to some extent.
John Swinney will be delighted. He will be absolutely
privately,
delighted.
you think?
Privately, he will be delighted because this issue has ripped his party apart over the past 2 years, and this is a chance for him to put it to bed. Where he's in much, not strong ground is why so much public money has been spent, kind of defending this, and I think that's where he might face questions. But privately, I think it would pop in the champagne corks.